Welcome to Swishu's podcast, where we're doing non-executive directorships with Thierry Fausten, David Jones, and myself, Bill Young. Now, this is going to be slightly different from previous episodes because we have someone who knows a bit more about the topic than we do in the room. I'll hand over to you, David, to start.
Thanks, Bill, and hello, everyone. Bill is an old friend from corporate life who came back to my mind when I read his hilarious letter published in The Economist regarding the right way for Danes to approach the Trump takeover of Greenland. I was so amused by it, I linked him with Bill and we reconnected. And not one to lose an opportunity, after a brief chat about old times, Bill has recruited me into this podcast to talk to you about my experiences as a non-executive director over 15 years. Now, I'll try and break the topic down by suggesting some common threads in what it means to be a NED, and then pointing out the differences in the types of role that are out there. And then we can have a formal exchange and thoughts and questions and observations. So let's start with those common threads, which are worth putting out there first in your thinking when you contemplate any position. What is common is that you need to be clear whose interest you are representing when you're a director, non-executive director. You need to understand, secondly, what happens if things go wrong. And thirdly, you need to understand what is expected of you and what life will be like, how much work will be involved, and whether you're going to enjoy it. Now, if being a non-executive director seems somewhat daunting if you haven't done it before, then reflect that hardly anyone of a certain age starts without some relevant experience. Most of us have some experience of being an NED. Maybe you were once a fixtures captain of your tennis club, a school governor. You might have been charged with organising a history society trip to Rome. These are all simple examples of where you've given your time, usually for free, to realise an outcome that others depend on. The above three questions apply to those circumstances and to the big business world as well. So let's go through these questions in a bit more detail. All commercial operations should be governed in the interests of the owners. NEDs are independent of management. Indeed, that is a mandated test for the appointment of an NED to a listed entity. It means you do not own a business that is trading with the entity, your wife or partner doesn't work there, you're not a lawyer selling services to it, etc. Interestingly, and in line with the principle that NEDs work in the interest of the owners, NEDs are encouraged and in some circumstances obliged to be shareholders in the company that they're serving. Now we get to the differences. Big listed company owners are a great diverse population of shareholders, diverse in the number of shares each individual owns, where they're domiciled, how much they know about what they've invested in. Some shareholders are totally unconnected. Some industry tracker investors are compulsory owners of your company and won't have made a conscious decision to invest in you at all and might not even know they do unless they look closely. But there are those that are interested in you. For instance, one share buys you a platform at the annual general meeting. It happens a lot. Grandstanders are entitled to a platform at your annual show and use it to promote an aspect of ESG, environment, society, and governance that they're passionate about. Sometimes this can be a bit disruptive and they can filibuster a whole morning away. Others with a more business critical view on change can purchase a significant shareholding and become activists for change. NEDs must comply with statutory obligations which trump the interest of shareholders and cannot be challenged. But the ESG, the environment, social and governance policies that a company may adopt or not, are not statutory. They're discretionary and can be perceived by shareholders to be in their interests or against their interests. We've seen a really extreme example of this in the last month when BP, who for several years publicly declared a move away from oil and gas towards renewables, have underperformed their peers who made no such moves and are now badly in the grip of activist shareholder activity. Then there are proxy voter organizations that have delegated shareholder decision-making. They can vote down a resolution at a company's annual general meeting. Proxy companies are paid for their work. to hold boards to account and therefore incentivized to be seen as active in support of their clients. A successful proxy challenge is known as a strike and is usually, but not always, to do with challenging what they regard as excessive executive compensation. This is fueled by a common perception that NEDs are in a revolving circuit to bid up C-suite salaries in the hope of return favors. Now, if proxy strikes cannot be rectified by amending the resolution, it can get serious and boards have been removed following deadlock. So, although the simple test of you work in the interests of the owners of the company is paramount, there are a lot of wrinkles and a lot of bumps on the road. Now, let's turn to another sort of company, private equity companies. Private equity companies consist of fund managers who raise and invest shareholder money in companies they buy, run, and then sell. They employ seasoned financial investors who can analyze and assess businesses across many sectors and have the teams to run and monitor their acquisitions. They work keenly to buy well, and as soon as an acquisition is made, they begin planning for a hoped-for lucrative exit. They often appoint non-executive chairmen, usually to guide them in their acquisition process before they commit, so as to be advised of non-obvious peculiarities and pitfalls of the sector they're entering, and then also to front up some of the acquisition work with the company targeted and to help the PE company find acquirers and a successful exit. Now, the role of the chairman or NED is less about holding management to account of these interests because the board is packed with the owner's commercial team. It's also not much to do with strategy since the PE group holding is time horizon limited. During the operation period of PE ownership, the chairman's role is more about an external figurehead, an incidental and occasional advisor. And finally, let's talk about startups. All these businesses begin life as unlisted companies seeking financial support for a founder's idea. Investors are often retail investors with an interest in innovation. Often they're professional VCs attracted to the concept. They usually focus on the emergent and spread their bets. They know only that 1 in 5 ventures will succeed. One winner needs to have a 10 times return to make this kind of activity worthwhile on average. Investors want to see seasoned ex-managers as non-executive directors with deep domain knowledge and experience in the sector that is the subject of the innovation to improve the chance of success. They're interested in seeing performance goals that may be events rather than just money. Good NEDs will focus and guide management in the assembly of these goals, laying out a 10-year vision. It's all part of the conviction forming process, so important for fundraising. Now, startups can be IPO'd, initial public offering, on AIM, which is a minor market listing in the UK. It's a UK special, but it is a category of listing which has fewer reporting burdens, is cheaper to IPO in and run with. But a company going in this direction has to appoint an investment bank to guide their governance activities and maintain investor confidence. These banks are called Sherpas, and a Sherpa iBank should be experienced in the needs of reporting requirements on AIM and keep the little company out of trouble. They're appointed to help startups who may be technically brilliant but who are likely to fall into pitfalls, not expert in those aspects. So mostly investors in AIM are similar individuals that invest in their unlisted cousins, retail enthusiasts or smaller funds, but perhaps at a lower risk end of that spectrum. On AIM, there are fewer but better informed shareholders than is usual in big listed companies, and investors and fund managers take a much keener interest in the events and life of the company. Lots turn up at the AGM with a genuine interest and ask penetrating questions of the NEDs and the CEO. Communicating with them is onerous, but essential to maintain confidence and ensure the next money raise. Again, the responsibility of the NEDs is value creation, which in this case must be a mix of milestones like patent awards, regulatory consents achieved, etc., along with more conventional balance sheets and P&L performance aspects. So that's who you're representing, and those are the sorts of people you might meet in those different NED circumstances. So the second question, what happens if things go wrong? In a public listed company, NEDs are liable if they fall short on their duties. Principally, problems may occur when there is not timely and simultaneous disclosure of events that are material in the life of the company. Other watchouts are share dealings with inside knowledge or failure in discharging statutory obligations. NEDs can be sued by owners who suffer loss due to non-compliance, and so liability insurance should always be asked for if you're contemplating a NED position in a listed company. The package can be surprisingly large. PE companies are 100% owned by the company, and therefore the PE house is solely responsible for mandated compliance, which they usually do as a centralized function for all their enterprises. The appointment of an external NED on a PE board has not, in my experience, ever resulted in a director personal liability, but that's limited to my experience. NEDs in those companies that are listed in AIM are audited, as are the big board companies, and in case of AIM, they're somewhat protected by their Sherpa, who is deemed more expert and has formal oversight obligations for which they receive compensation. NED personal liability insurance is still advisable. Now, let's go on to the third question, which is, what is it that will be expected of you, and will you enjoy it? I think that's such an important point. Somebody who has spent a long career in corporate life and is in retirement and taking up one of these positions, had better make sure that it's going to be fun. Again, there are differences in the experience you will have according to the type of enterprise. Now, listed companies deal a lot with governance issues which are not in business terms making the boat go faster. Mostly statutory reporting on matters of safety and health, environment, diversity compliance, quarterly reporting, anti-slavery awareness, the audit of suppliers for foreign corrupt practices, etc. Now, these considerations by no means take up all the board time, which is usually very much concerned with strategy implementation, management performance, and if necessary, deal making. But they are important and essential and mandated. They come to the board according to their annual or quarterly cycle, and they're interesting, but might not get everybody's juices going. There is also a practice of main board subcommittees, which examine technical aspects such as audit and risk, people and safety, and innovation in the company. These committees examine these aspects in greater detail with management and make recommendations to the board. It's a very sensible device that permits more managerial challenge without unduly congesting the main board agendas. Now, if your skills are appropriate to any of these committees, you'll be a very strong candidate for an NED role in multiple sectors. PE companies have commercial and financial representatives around the table, as I mentioned, and they're very much concerned about making the boat go faster. And to generalize, they are less interested in strategic considerations. Their compliance functions are centralized, and they oversee that function in individual enterprises and make sure they're compliant. They still have their funds to report to, but since fund participants do not have the right to buy and sell positions in these funds once committed, timely and simultaneous disclosure of material variances is not the same issue. Right, let's go on and wind up with startups, which are preoccupied with funding and driving to self-sufficiency before their money runs out. These are the most business-intimate NED roles you can be offered. Interesting, but not for the faint-hearted. And with reputational risk if the few you choose fail one after another. So take care and do your homework. You will likely find yourself much preoccupied with people matters as events and needs transition quickly from a founder's technical idea to building a business around it. Only rarely does a skill resident in one individual stretch across all these functions. Mr. Gates and Mr. Jobs aside, most of us have our strengths and weaknesses in a narrow band. The NED role in a startup is to call these limits and make changes, usually in the face of grave disappointment by founders and sometimes to the perplexity of shareholders who have backed the person. In this activity, recruitment and timing of change is everything. So with that background, I'm very happy to take questions, comments, challenges, anything you like.
That's super, David. Thank you very much indeed. I hadn't expected quite such structure, which is very useful. And I am surprised to reach the conclusion, and you'll correct me on this if I'm wrong, it looks as though being a non-executive director of a startup is actually the most challenging of the three that you described, the public company, the private equity, and the startup. The startup seems to be the one that requires the deepest skill set.
Well, I think in some sense, yes, because it's quite simple in that the aims of the company can usually be written on one side of A4. And the goals that have to be achieved are equally few. And so, whereas in a big company, there are a multiplicity of issues and trade-offs that have to be made, which means understanding the merits of propositions coming from a variety of quarters. With a startup, actually, it's all about achievement and that achievement of transparent things. And that does put the onus on people, both in terms of the quality of their understanding of the outside world that's going to help them deliver those things and their ability to seize opportunities and structure works to that end. So there's more people challenge, certainly, in a startup. There's less, I think, in business understanding than in a bigger company, which is more complex.
Super. Thanks, David. Thierry?
Just out of curiosity, this role of NED seems pretty challenging, whatever the context, and sometimes without a reward or a financial incentive at the end. So, did you go for it, or were you pushed? And why do you stay? And I'm asking that because it can be surprising for some that you just volunteer for such an intense activity.
Well, I'm one of those sad individuals who enjoyed my corporate life. And although I have a very full list of hobbies and a great time in my free time, there was a little bit of missing the in tray. I wanted to fill at least some of my space with active engagement in things that I have been exposed to a long time, and I think I understand. So that's why I went to it. You're quite right. It's not lucrative, and it does have liabilities. But there's a certain joy, I think, in working with teams at that level, and a certain fraternity, which is also a feature of corporate life, which I certainly missed, and it's what I get from my secondary jobs now.
I'd like to come back in. There's a perception among some people, myself for a while, that NEDs quite often represent the great and the good, and that they bring a certain glister to the board, and that people are looking for individuals with a reputation and respect in order that some of that is reflected onto the companies. Quite often, members of the House of Lords are identified as potential in the UK, for instance, and I guess their equivalents in other countries. People with some sort of societal position are identified. But from what you're saying, especially in the startup field, that appears not to be the case.
I've never been on a board that had, I think the English term is stuffed shirts, though they may be senior stuffed shirts. I've been very fortunate that all of my colleagues have brought something to the table in the way of expertise. I think I alluded to it in the preamble, but in listed companies where you have complex functions that need to have detailed appraisal, audit, safety and health, innovation were the examples I gave. It's much better to have somebody who's got a track record in all of that. I acknowledge what you say, but I've not been part of that and it wouldn't attract me.
Thierry, I got two questions which are related but opposite, but I'll hand over to you for a question first.
My understanding of an NED role is really about bringing objectivity and, a bit an external view on what's happening and helping the company to really take an helicopter view without having an agenda on your own. But then when you explained a bit earlier that sometimes you need to be an investor, you need to have, skin in the game, how do you keep that objectivity and neutrality? I mean, it's probably an exercise in style.
Well, I think you're quite right, Terry. It's a great question. There is an opportunity when selecting candidates for boards to take people who have knowledge relevant to your business, but from other businesses, and bring in other perspectives, maybe other countries if your business is international but domiciled in a remote place. So it's an important function to bring this colour and expertise to the board. But essentially, boards are there to support and occasionally challenge management. And so I would say that the weighting is around the ability to understand the business and be effective as a board member. You probably have some questions about what does it mean to be effective. And I think it's a balance between challenge and support, which has to be learnt because it's not something that you get as a manager of many years standing in corporate life. where your instinct is to roll up your sleeves and grab hold of the problem and start fixing it. That's something you have to resist. And also, I think you have to resist the notion that this is a game of cat and mouse where board members will say gotcha when there's a mistake in a management presentation. That doesn't work either. I think it is about supporting management, and it's about letting management know what it is that is relevant for board consideration, because an awful lot of management time goes into preparing papers for the board. It's a big moment for management when they're in front of the board, and those need to be successful outings. They need to be outings that encourage management and are motivating and not, if you like, tests. So the whole culture of that interaction is extremely important, and it's terribly important that the chairman sets the tone for those discussions and makes sure that that kind of culture emerges.
Mine is essentially a follow-up from that, but it's how you find out what's actually going on in the company. We did talk a few days back, and you said it. Within a year or two, you become pretty good at knowing what's going on in the company. But a non-executive director is reliant on data from the company and on communications with people in the company. And those communications can be controlled, even restricted by some executives. And I can think of one or two examples in my own background. But I do remember several years back when someone we both knew who had been CEO of a pharmaceutical company went to be chairman of a bank in Scotland. He knew very little about banking and finance, probably knew a bit about finance, but not a lot about banking. And when the bank went belly up during the crash, it did look as though he'd been chosen specifically because he didn't understand banking and couldn't get into it. And so how do you be sure that you're getting enough information about the company?
I'm not going to comment on that example, which I think a lot of people would recognize, but I will try and go back one step, which is this business about how do you actually cut through the layers of the onion and decide whether you're getting quality feed or not. I think it depends a lot on the character and the diligence of the CEO, because the CEO is only going to put his people up in front of the board to basically have decisions made to advance his, i.e. the CEO's agenda, to take decisions that impact on the resources of the company that are reserved for board approval. So they're important moments. And if in several iterations of these presentations, and sometimes by the same function, cracks appear in the plaster, and it's clear that inconsistencies are there, and that reflects poorly not only on the presenters, but also on the CEO. And so I think support of the CEO, but trust in the CEO, but with alert antennae to what you're being told, is a way to appraise and feel the probity of what you're being told. Because you're quite right, since, as I say, so much work goes into these papers, which, by the way, is no bad thing. It does mean that people have to clear their minds and be quite synthetic about their work and bring it all together to a series of recommendations. It's not the sort of thing that one does on a weekly basis. So they are helpful even before a word is spoken in the room. But if those presentations, onerous though they may be, are not consistent through time or across departments that are presenting different aspects of a similar problem, then this is a matter for the CEO and it would be taken up with him. But it's not something that is preying on my mind or has been a conspicuous cause of concern for me. What I try to do often is to mentor managers around what it is they do when they get on their feet in front of the board, because very often they will write a 20-page report and then almost read it to you in the boardroom. And what needs to be done is that the essence of the argument and the recommendation needs to be filleted and presented, so it gives time for discussion, and you have to assume that your board colleagues have done their homework and read their notes. So, I mean, there's a stylistic thing as well as an ethical probity thing around making sure that the truth as understood and believed by management comes forward to the board.
Super. And I have a follow-up from that, if I may. That was about getting information from the company. The next is about getting information from outside the company and delivering it to the organization. And I confess a bias here because in my relatively narrow experience, I've reached the conclusion that companies are especially more mature companies, are very, very bad at understanding the environment in which they operate. I don't think they really understand society, global economics, politics. They don't understand how other companies operate, and they don't appear to have dedicated resources in-house. They tend to rely too much on consultants for getting that type of information. And I wonder, is that a role non-executive directors can fulfill in terms of identifying what is the environment, how is it changing, and what is the survivability of the organization that you're a non-executive in?
I think that's a great question, Bill, and it's a difficult question because you're right. There's been some spectacular examples of companies being blindsided to events, and a lot of those companies don't exist anymore. There is, of course, a momentum within a company which is behind their products that they cherish, their market positions that they built up over many years, and the achievements of the careerists who are now making policy. All of those things are against the notion of being disruptive, and the trade-off here is between having a sufficient information to be aware of disruptive opportunities and having a platform for disruptors to show their wares, because the steady state momentum is what gets attention because it's monitored and improvements are applauded, even if they're incremental, and ignore the big elephant's foot that's just about to come down. So it's a great question, and I don't think any company can really say they're immune to its problems. So the companies that I've worked in, the big ones, have got strategic units that are obliged to be looking at these matters and coming with external environmental information, but it still is a risk, and it's not something that has been fixed in my view.
Super. Thanks very much indeed. Thierry, you got something?
You mentioned it's a topic that I like from the supply chain and procurement perspective. It's ESG and the role of NEDs in pushing the ESG agenda that some boards do not always like. So I would like to hear your view on that.
Well, I think
popular topic.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And the pendulum is swinging now following Mr. Trump's election, isn't it? What I tried to say in the preamble here is there's a distinction between obligatory, i.e. mandated ESG activities, anti-slavery audits, compliance in procurement against foreign corrupt practices, all of those things. If you don't get that right, if you slip down below certain standards, then there are consequences. But then there's a whole panoply beyond that of how should a company work in its environment and its society? How open should it be? Who cares about it? What stakeholders? All of those things that you are alluding to are important. And they are the ones where companies have to decide whether they wish to be as good as their peers, or to lead their peers, or to be just good enough to pass muster. And they may have different views about how that should be done in different aspects of ESG. And a chemical company might be extremely sensitive to matters of the environment because their operators are working in chemical factories, might have a lighter touch on diversity and female numbers or what have you. So, there is a difference between sectors and between companies and decisions they make on these matters. And as I also mentioned, if you get very far out of kilter by adopting a stance which may look radical and to the previous question might look to be anticipating disruption by moving in a direction that is considered to be the way the world's working, like BP and renewables, then if you go too early or if you go too intensely, it spoils the numbers, then there will be consequences of that too. So there's no substitute for walking the tightrope and being aware of all of these matters and making conscious decisions about how much, how fast, and in which directions.
I think I've got my final question. And when I said I was going to be talking to on this podcast about non-executive directorships, I got one or two people who said, hey, I've always thought about that. It might be being a governor or a trustee of a charity, or it might be helping startups in some way. But they were put off by the thought that perhaps they needed to look like you called it a stuffed shirt, but they might need to be more elevated, and they might need to have some really heavyweight directorial executive experience already in order to qualify for it. But I've been encouraged by what you said about some of the startup roles being a little bit, I know you're not allowed to be hands-on, but having shorter term goals, being possibly more directive, more insightful. If someone is thinking along those lines, David, what advice do you think you would give them? Do you think you'd say wait until you're actually a director before you even think about being a non-executive director? Or would you say there's things you could be doing today that would look good on a CV for applying for a non-executive role? Or is there networking opportunities? What advice, if any?
Yeah, great question. If you want to be a non-executive director of a FTSE 100 or top company in Germany, Switzerland, then you should brush down your CV and go and see Korn Ferry or one of the headhunters, because they will be able to give you good advice on whether your skills are appropriate, and they will know every opportunity going in that small pool. And of course, non-executive directors serve for a limited time, so there's a rotation, and they will know what's going on. So that's the way to go if you want to be in the league of the large listed companies. If you want to be supportive of private equity, then there's no harm, and I've done it in the past, if you're particularly impressed by one particular private equity house, to write to them and say, this is what I do. This is what I've done. So I was a manager and I have vast experience in this area. They will list you and they will call you when there is an acquisition where your skills are essential for them to make the right judgments. And that may lead to an appointment in the acquired company, or it can just lead to an episode where you're with the acquisition team, which can be quite fun, looking at a target and figuring out what it's worth and how it could operate. The sorts of things that you can bring to that party will be dependent on the skills you've had as a manager. So you don't have to be a director to be helpful in that area. On startups, well, there is a very poor record of management of startups, and there is a great demand for seasoned managers to help. And I think the technical knowledge is less important than the fact that you've been exposed to 10, 20, 25 years in corporate life where you have learnt instinctively and can replay from your gut the checks and balances of how things get done and expectations of success based on previous knowledge of projects within a corporation. So I don't think there is a fantastically high bar, particularly in startups. And I think there is a dearth of people who are willing to take it on. For some of the reasons that I gave, the rewards are small. The activity can be intense at times when you have to go and raise money. And you get involved in personnel matters that can be awkward, but mustn't be ducked. Otherwise, you're not doing your job.
Thanks, David. A lot of people will be very encouraged by that.
I look at my colleagues from the past and think, if I had a few of those around me, that would help. It's not, you don't have to have had a career that is conspicuously senior. I think you need to be competent, interested, and thoughtful.
Thanks, David. Thierry, you got a final question?
What I was saying, David, is thank you. It was very, very insightful.
Well, nice to meet you, Terry. And whatever you do next, I'm sure Bill will keep me informed. And thank you for your interest.
Thierry, David, thank you very much indeed. That's it from Non-Executive Directorships in episode 8. And we look forward to Swishu's episode 9. Thanks to both of you. Cheerio.
Thank you, Bill, and goodbye.